President, please be seated. The court is now back in session, and we continue giving the floor to the co-prosecutor to continue putting questions to the witness. The chamber also wishes to be advised as to how much time co-prosecutor would need to put questions to this witness, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I spoke to the civil party lawyers at the break. They indicated that they would require about half an hour. So I will endeavor to finish by 3:30 and then turn it over to the civil parties so that they can finish their questioning today.
Counsel for the civil parties. Thank you, Mr. President. Civil party lawyers may need lesser time than that, and Counsel Van Po and my other colleague will be putting questions to the witness. The President. Thank you. Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. The last general subject area that I'd like to ask you some questions about today, Mr. Witness, concerns the administrative structure, lines of authority, and communications in Chi Krang district during the Democratic Kampuchea regime. You told us, identified in your OCIJ interview, and mentioned earlier this afternoon that the original chief of the Pongro Security Office was a Ta Von, who was later arrested and replaced by a Ta Kun. Can you tell us to whom did Ta Von and Ta Kun report? Who was their superior?
Response. Ta Von and Ta Kun were inferior than people at the district level. So these two people received orders, instructions from the head of the district committee, and they were in charge of the security center indeed.
And who was the head of the district committee to whom they reported?
Response. Ta Sun was the chief of the district during the time when Ta Von was also at work, and later on Sok was the successor. When Ta Sok was the head of the district, he accused Ta Von and Ta Von's associates of being betrayal. And then at a later date, Ta Sok installed Ta Kun as the head of security. So these people were closely related in issuing orders or making any decision.
You indicate in your OCIJ interview that Ta Sok came from the southwest zone. Can you tell us what year it was that Ta Sok came from the Southwest Zone and arrested and replaced the previous district leaders.
Response. I don't remember the date. Tasok was in the southwest, but not at Takao. He was in Kampot, because Kampot and Takao were part of the southwest zone. And I don't remember which year it was when the people from Takao were accused of being traitors.
And just before the break, we talked about the civilian evacuees, the 17 April people who had been sent to Chikrang district. Can you tell the court what happened to the 17 April people in your district after Tasok and the Southwest Zone cadres arrived?
Response. After Tasok later on became the head of the district, the 17th of April people still were under surveillance and they were still badly treated. They were accused of being affiliated with the imperialists, the American imperialists. They were still made to do hard labor, and they did not enjoy comfortable life or happiness at all, because they were still regarded as people from different class.
I'd like to refresh your recollection and refer you to another statement from your 1991 interview with Henri Locard. This is again document D83, Annex 00012. The reference is at Khmer 00812-868, English 00164-159, and French 00779-387. And at this part of the document, the following statement is attributed to you, quote, "After the execution of the ex-leaders, the Niriday continued to arrest and massacre the 17th April. PCCS does not know the place of execution, but saw a lorry covered by palm leaves that every day transported inhabitants to execute them, and in brackets, or take them to another prison, question mark. The Niriday established another district prison in Kampong Kadai Pagoda, end of quote. Can you tell us where it was that you saw a lorry or truck taking away 17 April people?
Response. The detainees were transported to be executed at Kampong Kadai. It happened because the Khmer Rouge said that the 17th of April people revolted against the Khmer Rouge, and it was part of the policy to arrest any of them who were seen carrying a machete or an axe or a club. At first, there was an excuse. The Khmer Rouge tricked those people who had killed some Khmer Rouge soldiers to come forward with machete, axe, or club for a meeting, and later on they were arrested. They were rounded up, and people would be tied. The people would be then loaded on the truck when their hands were bound behind their back.
Thank you. My colleague asked you, and you previously indicated that Chi Krang district was part of the Siem Reap sector. Do you know to whom the Chi Krang district secretary reported?
Response. The secretary of Chi Krang had to report to the sector whose leader I don't know, but the Chi Krang was under the sector that includes both Siem Reap and Udon Mien Chey provinces.
In your interview with Henri Locard back in 1991, you referred to a person named Ta Sot, who was the head of the Dambon. Do you remember a person named Ta Sot, and who was he?
Response. I don't recollect every detail regarding the interview I gave to Henri Locard, but I now remember that the person whose name you mentioned was the chief or the secretary of sector of Siem Reap and Udon Mien Chey. It was Ta Sot, indeed.
Do you recall whether there was a period of time during which the Siem Reap sector was not part of a zone, but instead was an autonomous sector that reported directly to the center?
Response. I don't know. I am not able to respond to this question, I'm afraid.
I'd like to turn to a few questions about communications and authority issues. In your OCIJ interview, you indicate that confessions from the District Security Office were delivered to the Chi Krang District Committee. Can you describe for the court how these documents were prepared and what information was contained in the documents that were sent to the District Committee?
Response. With regard to the reporting regime, for prisoners who had been brought in from other locations to their security center, it was the commune chief who had to file the report and who arranged for someone to bring them in. When people came in, they would be shackled, and their names and some personal details would then be kept, and the record would be submitted to the district, who made the final decision to see whether these individuals had to be freed or further detained or executed. So Takun did not make any decision on his own accord. He had to go through the district for final decision. This is what I knew for sure.
As the clerk of the district security office, was it part of your job to record interrogations or confessions which were then delivered to the district committee?
Response. As to the confessions, I was the one who took the notes, but it was not I who was the decision maker. I was made to take records of the confessions, and these confessions would then be submitted to the chief of security, who would make the decisions.
I want to refer you to another statement from your 1991 interview with Henri Locard. This is at Khmer page 00812-865, English 00164-156, and French ERN 00779-385. Where you made the following reference, quote, "Reports were first made on separate sheets. Then PCCS copied them into a big ledger book that was deposited with the head Kama People." Continuing later, "Prisoners did not sign the reports, but they stamped it with the fingerprint of their thumb." My question concerns the ledger book that's referenced here. Can you tell us what information was included in that ledger book and who that information was provided to?
Response. As stated, with regard to the log book, this book had to go through the district level to have a final say as to whether each individual had light or serious or heavy offenses, and that the district level, district chief would make the decision on how these people would be treated. Indeed, whether they should be executed or released, or how long these people continue to be detained. And as for the thumbprints, or how the paper was were given thumbprint or not, I don't recollect this very well.
Did the district secretaries ever come to the security office?
Response. Tasun. Yes, before Tasun was accused of being a traitor, he came to the security center to converse with the security personnel and the detainees. He would then call all detainees, both men and women, to come and meet him, and it was on that occasion that I saw him coming to the place.
On the issue of authority, the authority of the district level, you state in your OCIJ interview, this is document D125/127, at Khmer page 00224-053, English page 00225-212, and French page 00239-979, you make the following statement, quote, "The Pongro Security Office was under the command of the district. Only when there were orders from the district were there any interrogations, releases, or killings," end of quote. My question for you is, do you know whether the district secretary or the district committee had authority to make decisions on executions themselves, or whether they also had to receive orders from the higher echelon to which they reported?
Response. I do not know whether orders or decisions were made higher up as well, because when Kun brought the cases to the district, I have no idea how decisions were made. Nonetheless, when people had to be sent out for executions, I could note that some of the prisoner details were crossed out in red, and these people could be executed. That's my observation. So whether the district received from any higher up, it's beyond my knowledge. I only learned that when the document returned to the security center, then I would be knowledgeable of the detail of which, but not further than that.
And can you tell us, you make reference to this in your OCIJ interview as well, that there were documents that came from the district that had either crossouts in red or notations. Can you describe to us what these documents were that came from the district?
Response. I wish to also emphasize that there was no writing from the district. There were some cross-outs on the name to be sent out. For example, if a person by the name of A had to be released, then there would be a red marks, a cross-out on the name. And if the person had to be released, then there would not be any remarkable annotations or marks on that. So I observed no other writing other than the cross-out. Indeed, as indicated, people who had to be executed would have their names crossed out in red, and those who had to be released would never have their names crossed out or marked.
I thank you for your time today, Mr. Witness, in responding to our questions. Mr. President, that is all the questions we have at this time.
Mr. President, thank you. Now I hand over to the lead co-lawyer for the civil parties and the delegated lawyers for the civil party to put the question to the witness in question. You may proceed. Lawyer. Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon, Your Honors. Good afternoon, everyone in and out of the courtroom. Good afternoon, Mr. Witness. I have only a few questions to put to you. I simply want to seek clarification in addition to what the prosecution has already asked you. I would like to bring up the written record of interview dated the 10th of September 2008, document D125/127, ERN in Khmer 00224051, English 00225210, and French 00239976. In this written record, you said following 1975, you also saw people evacuate people as well as Lon Nol soldiers, and they were evacuated to old houses in Chikraing district, and you said you saw the evacuation of Lon Nol soldiers and officers of the Lon Nol regimes, and you also witnessed the evacuation of ordinary people from Siem Reap downtown center to Chikraing district, and you also further testified that not only did you see the evacuation of people from Siem Reap, but you also learned that there were evacuation of people across the country, particularly people were evacuated from Siem Reap province to other provinces and countrysides. So my question to you, based on this evacuation of a mass evacuation of people, did you witness the presence of the Buddhist monk among the population who were being evacuated at that time? Response. If I understand your question correctly, is that whether or not I saw any Buddhist monk among the mass population who were being evacuated. Actually, I did not pay much attention at the time to the different category of people, because I actually at that time worked as in the security office in Pung Ro. So the information that I learned at that time was the Lon Nol soldiers and former official of the Lon Nol administrations who were evacuated out of Siem Reap city. Question. Did you hear or see it with your own eyes of the people or evacuee who were evacuated from Siem Reap province? Did you see or hear whether there were the elderly people, the sick, or children being evacuated among the mass population? Response. I knew the evacuation of people following the 17th of April 1975 out of Siem Reap and Phnom Penh, and all people were evacuated, the handicapped, the elderly people, the young and old, and everyone, virtually everyone were evacuated, but I did not pay attention to the issue of Buddhist monk. I did not know whether or not there were Buddhist monk among the populations who were moved. And as I said, I did not really know it very well because I was attached to the security office at that time. But as far as I knew from others was that all population, all people were evacuated. So they told me about this, but I myself did not witness it by my own eyes. Question. Concerning the evacuation of people out of Siem Reap city, did you see or hear or were you told about the means by which the population used in order to move out of the city into the countryside? Response. The evacuation was on foot. There was no any vehicles or any means to get out of the city. The situation was terrible and miserable. There were dead people along the streets. Some families lost their loved ones. And as for the distance, you may also be aware that some were evacuated out of Phnom Penh city, and then they had to go all the way to the deep in the countryside. And if the evacuees were from Siem Reap city, it was not that far compared to those who were evacuated out of Phnom Penh city, because they went to the countryside just outside the city. Question. Did you observe the food were distributed to the evacuees at the time, or did you hear about the distribution of food to the evacuees while being evacuated out of the city at the time? Response. I met one of the evacuees himself, and he told me that he was provided with no food at all, and he had to be all on his own, and the situation was miserable. And if the difficulty and suffering he endured was indescribable. Particularly, they were starving, and they did not have access to medicine or health care, and they had to endure through constant fear of being accused of betraying the organization. So this is the fact, and I cannot describe them all. It's the misery they have endured in life. Question. You told the court in response to the questions by the prosecution, you said Chi Krang was under the control of the Khmer Rouge in 1972. So my question to you is that before 1975, did the Khmer Rouge organize any meetings or any gathering in order to receive the new people or 17 April people in your locality? Response. They did not organize any event or anything at all to receive the new people. The new people actually at that time ran the risk of being accused as traitors. So they had constant fear, and people, particularly the Khmer Rouge, did not have the sentiment for the evacuee, particularly the new people. There was a clear segregation between the new people and old people. Thank you. I move on to my next question concerning the overall well-being and situation of the new people who were evacuated. And those people were later named the 17 April people. I would like to ask you for clarification. When the new people were evacuated and they settled down in a remote place, or they were incorporated into cooperatives and they had to live along with the old people or base people, did you observe the food ration? Did you observe any difference between the food ration distributed to the old people and new people? Response. The 17 April people were evacuated to the countryside, and before they got there, the cooperatives had already been established. So at that time, in those cooperatives, they act collectively. So when they were evacuated into those localities, they had to eat in a communal hall collectively with the old people. But people did not really get along well with each other. The Khmer Rouge asked the old people to consider the 17 people April as those who had lived with the Lon Nol administration. So the old people allowed the new people to work with them with hatred, and they mistreated the new people as well. That's what I know about the situation of the new people. Question. I would like to expand further on this in relation to the freedom of the 17 April people and the base people. Do you observe any difference in terms of freedom of movement or so between the two categories of people? Response. There was a world of difference, because as for hard labor work was destined for the new people, and as for the position, the new people held no position at all. They had to be under the supervision and control of the base people, and they had to go without many things in life. They had to go hungry most of the times. That was the situation of the new people. When they were sick, they had no access to medicines. So as a consequence, a big number of 17 April people died during that period. Mr. President, I would like to seek your leave to read the same document, D125/127, Khmer 00224052, English 00225211, and French 00239977. I would like to touch upon the moral misconduct. I would like to read it out. Some prisoners who were killed were accused of connecting with the Vietnams, or they had committed immoral misconduct. So I would like to ask you, at your locality, was there any session convened in order to adjudicate on the issue of moral misconduct of people? Response. The mere term misconduct to the Khmer Rouge was that they had affairs or nuptial affair. And in the re-education session, sometimes they took both of them to be re-educated, and at other times they took only one side of the pair for re-education. As for the base people, they were also subject to similar punishment if they were found having affairs or extra marital affairs with other people. But base people were treated with a more lenient punishment than the old people, than the new people. Question. In relation to the same topic concerning the moral misconduct, did you observe whether there was any cases of punishment because of the moral misconduct between the old people or base people with the new people? Response. Well, as far as the moral misconduct was concerned, there was no distinction whether or not this misconduct was committed by the old people, the base people, or the new people. So long as there was immoral misconduct, this was subject to punishment. But most of the time, those who were arrested were the young ladies. There were cases of the affairs between the base people and the 17 April people. Question. This is going to be my last question. You worked in the administration of the Khmer Rouge, even though it was in the lower rank. Did you ever listen to the statement made or broadcast on radio by the senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge? Response. If you ask me whether or not I know the development, whether it be political or social development of the country through radio broadcast, I did not know. I had little access to radio, but I learned information about the meeting convened in my internal office. But if you ask me whether or not I ever listened to the radio broadcast of the speeches or statement by the leaders, I did not. I only attended meeting to discuss security matters in my security office and the work procedures in my place. And when the situation was looming, they convened more open meeting where more members were invited to attend the meeting of this kind. Just a bit of clarification. Did you know or were you ever told the position of the current co-accused before these extraordinary chambers during the Democratic Cambodia period? Were you ever told the roles of these senior leaders at that time? Response. They told us, the senior leaders, they told the roles of those leaders. For example, Mr. Khieu Samphan was then the president of the state presidium, and Pol Pot was the secretary of the Communist Party of Cambodia, so on and so forth. But most of the time, they told us about the roles of either Pol Pot or Khieu Samphan. Rarely did we hear about the role of Ieng Sary. And to my recollection, they did tell us about the role of Pol Pot and Khieu Samphan. Thank you, Mr. President. I have no further question for now for the witness, and I would like to hand over to my international colleague, the President. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon, Your Honors, and good afternoon, Mr. Witness. Now, I'd like to talk more about the evacuation of civilians from Siem Reap. Do you know if any of the civilians refused to leave the city at that time?
I'm afraid I cannot answer this question because it is beyond my duty. I do not know whether or not there were people who protested against the evacuation out of Siem Reap city, so I'm afraid it's beyond my knowledge.
Thank you. Were you aware of any incidents where the Khmer Rouge used force to get civilians to evacuate the city?
As for this question, I am going to respond to it based on my knowledge I learned from the people. When they were evacuating people out of Siem Reap city, they coerced them to leave the city. They even coerced them at gunpoint as well. They shoot into the air, threatening people to leave the city as quickly as possible. Otherwise, they would be punished or they would be killed, so on and so forth. So those who were supposed to evacuate the city dare not resist or protest against the order.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were dead bodies on the roads during the evacuation of the city. Do you know how those people died?
As for those who die along the roads, they die of one, starvation, two, because of diseases, and they did not have medicines or they did not have anyone to look up to. For example, children, young children, had no breast milk to feed, so they starved to death. And that was the misery. I cannot describe them all. There were many other miserable situations at the time.
Thank you, Mr. Witness. And did you receive any orders regarding how to treat the 17th of April people that were brought to your districts?
As for the treatment of the 17 April people, it was up to the base people. The base people were the host of the new people. Of course, it was under the supervision of the security side. But if, for example, there was any report of tardiness or laziness of the 17 people, then the security guards would seek to arrest them and put them in security center. That was what I know. But as for the other situation of the 17 April people, we did not know much.
And were any of the 17th of April people brought to Pongro Security Office while you were there?
I do not recall the exact number of the 17 April people who were imprisoned at the security office, but of course there were 17 April people who were reported by the base people, and they were arrested and sent to security office. And those 17 people were charged of moral misconduct, as I mentioned earlier, or they were accused of stealing something or the property of the cooperatives, and or sometimes they were arrested and on the charge of laziness or so those people were arrested and sent for re-education at the security center. So these were the cases of the arrest of the 17 April people.
Thank you. So in your position as clerk of the prison, were you instructed to specify whether the prisoners were 17th of April people when you kept records of their entry?
There was a clear division between old and new people. In that regime, they did not like the 17 April people. Actually, they simply wanted to get rid of the 17 April people. Those 17 April people who understand this motive, they pretend not to know anything, and they had to disguise themselves from time to time. For example, they were either the officials or teaching staff of the previous regime. They had to try to hide their identity, and those people had to be subjected to hard labor as well. And there was a clear segregation in that regime.
My question was more specific to the security office in Pongro, the one where you worked. I was asking if you were instructed to record whether or not the prisoners were 17th of April people.
Yes, there was. I received such an order. They asked me to make it clear whether or not the prisoner were from the base people or from the 17 April people. So there was an order from the top that I separated the list of prisoners.
And were these prisoners treated any differently in your security office?
Response: yes, they were. The treatment was different to these people. The 17th of April people would be put in other place, or if they were in the same place, then they would enjoy less superior position, or they were merely treated as subordinates, and that the other people would treat themselves as the boss, looking at the 17 of people who were their subordinates doing or performing their labor.
Thank you. And did you see any prisoners get hurt during your tenure at the office?
Response. I used to see how badly people were treated. When people were taken for interrogations, they would then be tortured if they failed to respond, to confess to what they wanted, or if they contested such questions, they would be whipped or beaten with sticks or clubs. And some serious offense prisoners who were being interrogated sometimes were tortured until they died.
And were any of the prisoners forced to write out a confession?
Response. Prisoners were not made to write anything, but I forget whether this was the case, that the prisoner would be asked to give their thumbprint on a confession, but at no time were they allowed to write their confession on their own accord. They could make give their confession, and the security personnel would then be there to record the confession. The confession, by the end of the day, these confession would then be put to the detainees to give thumbprint, as I remember.
And what would you do with these confessions? Who did you send these confessions to?
Response. The head of the security, the people who were in charge of confessions were there, who kept the confessions logbook. And after confessions were extracted, then the book would then be passed to the district chief, who then made the final decision on this.
And can you clarify what you mean by final decision? What decisions would the security chief make in regards to the confessions?
Response. What I was saying is that the final decision was made at the level of the chief of the district, because I saw the village chief, the final decision would be made by the district head indeed, and I would see the village chief coming on his bicycle to the center with the decision, and that's what I learned from that time. That's all I know.
I guess my question was actually about what was the decision regarding? Was it regarding how to treat that specific prisoner?
Response. I would like to say that the decisions were made in accordance with the severity of the offenses each prisoner or detainee committed. And you were asking about who made the decision on the charges or the severity of the offenses. I think no other people would be entitled to do this other than the chief of the district. He would be the only person who could make this decision, because to me, the head of security had no authority to have a final word on any of the offenses or severity of such offenses.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, do you know if any of the prisoners died while in prison?
Response: I saw several detainees die at the detention facility. Many died when remained shackled. I did not see them being executed, but I saw them dying in the detention center. And they had been detained under harsh conditions where they would be given only thin gruel. And during the cool season, a lot of people died in the detention center, and mostly male detainees. For the women detainees, they would be allowed to go out of the detention facility to work. Male detainees would never be allowed to go out at all.
And how did the prison dispose of their bodies?
Response: the bodies were buried, and for those who had been executed, they would be buried far from the detention facility, because the execution sites were far away from that. But those who died at the detention facility would be buried very close to the complex. Sometimes we could see shallow pits or graves where the scarf that once used by the detainees there. The President intervenes. Council, time passed by so quickly already, and your questions appear to be falling out of the matters or the scope of the general implementation of the policy during the first phase of the evacuation and also the local administration. If you framed your question to these confined areas, then you would get a lot from this witness. But when it comes to security center, I'm afraid it doesn't fall within the ambit of the segment of this closing order being debated now.
Okay, I apologize, Your Honor. May I continue with a few more questions, or is the time finished for the day?
The President, you may ask a few more questions indeed. However, please make sure that your questions are in the scope of the implementation of the policy concerning the first phase evacuation and also information that relevant to the local administrative structure. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to proceed with this. The Chamber would like to allow you to ask 3 more questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to go back to the information on the evacuation that you were discussing earlier. While the civilians were being evacuated, was there any effort to keep families together during the evacuation?
The President, International Co-Counsel for Mr. Nuon Chea, you may now proceed first.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be very brief in my objection because I understand time is short, but I would like counsel for civil parties to ask the witness specifically as to what he himself witnessed, what he saw, because the witness has so far been testifying a lot about things he has heard regarding the evacuation of Siem Reap. So I would request counsel for the civil parties to stress specifically what he himself saw.
I can refrain my questions. Sorry about that. Now, in the civilians that were brought to your district, was there any effort to keep families together within the district?
Response. I do not know about this in person, but looking at the situation of the 17th of April people, when people were evacuated from Siem Reap to the local area, these people had not been together before they were evacuated, or rather, these people could never be together. They were separated because the head of the cooperatives would disperse them, the forces, by dividing the people, by assigning them with different tasks at different locations. So that happened to the 17th of April people. Now, another example is that immediately upon arriving during the evacuation, people could meet, but only very briefly. But later on, according to the instructions by the cooperative chiefs, then the children would go to one direction and parents would then be asked to work elsewhere. They would no longer meet.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. I actually have no more questions.
The President, we thank you, Mr. Witness, for your patience and efforts in giving testimonies. Counsel Jasper Pao, you're on your feet. You may proceed first.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I'll be very brief, but it would be our request to take the statement that the witness has given to Mr. Henri Locard for the moment, so that the witness does not read this statement in the coming days. I would assume he comes back on Wednesday to testify. It does not only include his statements, the things that he told Mr. Henri Locard, but also certain observations and conclusions by Mr. Henri Locard. So to avoid contaminating the knowledge and testimony of this witness, we would request to, for the moment, take that document back so that the witness can testify as to what he remembers today, or rather on Wednesday.
The President, Counsel Canoas, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just very briefly, I didn't want to interrupt the proceedings earlier, nor cause embarrassment to anyone, but I noticed that Mr. Henri Locard was in the audience taking notes, which sort of begs the questions, how is it, perhaps it is by serendipity, that he decided to grace us with his presence in the audience here today, but how is it that he was here on the occasion when he's being mentioned? If, for instance, no one knew exactly who the gentleman was going to be today testifying, because he had a pseudonym. Thank you. Well, perhaps the trial chamber should look into this to see whether such information is being funneled out, and if so, by whom, or perhaps issue an edict that this sort of conduct should cease and desist. Thank you.
The President, International Court Prosecutor, you may now proceed. Court officer is now instructed to report to the transportation unit of general service to make sure that the buses have to be rescheduled so that the staff member can also catch the bus home, because the proceedings may be delayed a few minutes than previously expected.
Yeah, very, very quickly, Mr. President, just so the record is clear, I want to make it absolutely clear that our office has had no communications with Mr. Henri Locard. I can also tell you that it is not only probably by serendipity that he's here today, it was by fortune that I discovered this document that contained the witness's interview. I was unaware of that until sometime Thursday afternoon when I was doing some research on his district and happened to notice that in this report there was an interview of the witness. So I think it is extremely highly unlikely that this is anything other than serendipity, and I want to make sure the record is clear that our office has had no communications whatsoever with anyone regarding this witness.
President, does any other counsel wish to have any comments on this? And please don't be afraid that you will miss the bus, because the bus have already been asked to wait for us. The President, without further comments on this, the Chamber feels that it is now the close of the day session. The next session will be resumed by the day after tomorrow, which is Wednesday. And we continue to hear the testimonies of Mr. Pe Choi Chisai and also TCCP 82 for Wednesday sessions. Mr. Chisai, your testimony has not yet been concluded. The chamber wishes to hear you again on Wednesday, and you are invited to return to the courtroom on that day. Court officer is now instructed to assist with the VESU unit to ensure that the witness is properly accommodated or assisted during this break, and have him return to the courtroom on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow at 9 a.m. Jury counsel is also invited to assist the witness. And civil party needs to be escorted back to the home, and that the civil party is instructed to be returned to the courtroom on Wednesday as well. Counsel, you may proceed.
Now that the buses are waiting, Mr. President, I will be short. I may have missed it because it is late, but I don't think you've ruled on our request to take away the document from the witness, at least until he testifies on Wednesday.
The President, the Chamber will rule on this on the morning of 14th of November, before we proceed to counsels, because the document has already been placed and examined, and as to how we can resolve this to suit your need, the Chamber will rule on this on that date as indicated. Security personnel are now instructed to bring Mr. Nuon Chia Kiew Sompon to the detention facility and have them returned to the courtroom by 9 a.m. on the 14th of November. The court is adjourned.